So we start with the first letter S of that solid principles, which is single responsibility principle. And here I am on the Wikipedia page. And this all fancy description is just a fancy way or more scientific way to say a simple thing, that one class or one method should be responsible for one thing and one thing only. That's if you strictly follow that principle. In reality, it's more about don't make longer method or longer classes which would be responsible for a lot of things. So if you divide your application into smaller pieces, smaller chunks, it would be easier to read, to maintain, and to not break other parts while editing the current part. Probably the main takeaway from that Wikipedia page is that class or function should have responsibility over a single part of that program. Let's take a look at the example. In fact, I will have two examples for you. First, and probably the most typical example for Laravel, is the store method of controller, which is responsible for too many things. Store method is responsible for validation, then for some logic of calculations, then creating the main data, and then creating something else, and only then returning redirect back to whatever route is success. And this is too long, so our store method doesn't have single responsibility. It is responsible for a lot of things. And there's a general rule of thumb in Laravel to make the controllers shorter and to divide that logic into somewhere else. So let's do exactly that, and let's make the controller responsible only for storing the data, so performing the action of storing the invoice wherever that action actually happens. So controller will just call that action somewhere in a separate class and then redirect to success message. And we do that in several steps. So request validate becomes a form request class. I've created that behind the scenes, app HTTP requests, store invoice request. So we just move all the validation array here and change that to store invoice request. And then we don't need any of this. Then we need to move all of that saving procedure into somewhere else. There are different ways how you can do that in Laravel, but basically you need to create any PHP class and call the class method from here. Typical example in Laravel, it's a service class, and you can create that manually just by doing app services new file. There is no Laravel command of make service or something, and I did create that already in app services invoice service. There is a class invoice service, not implementing or extending anything, with just the function of store new invoice, and it has specific parameters that we need for the invoice: date, name, and products. And then what's inside? We create the invoice with exactly the fields that we need, and we will discuss this separately in a minute. Get invoice number. And then basically we're repeating this thing just in service. So we can delete all of that, then type hint the service, so invoice service service. It's automatically resolved by Laravel, so we don't need to manually create that service. And then we can call service store new invoice with the parameters that we need. What are the parameters? They're listed here. And I will just copy and paste the piece to save you time. So store new invoice accepts these parameters: request, and then all of the request parts, invoice dates, products and quantities and stuff like that. You can do that the other way around, so you can pass full request or request validated from here, and you don't need too many parameters then, but this is more clear in my opinion. Service should not know about request, service should know just about the amount of data that it needs, because that service may be called from unit test, from artisan command, from wherever, which doesn't even have the request, but you need to be able to pass those parameters anyway. And then that service returns us the invoice instance, this one. So return invoices at the end of service. So we accept that here, invoice, and then we can redirect back with invoice number created successfully, right? So now our controller is much shorter. It is responsible only for calling the invoice saving procedure and redirecting back. So technically two things, but that's a typical example for Laravel controller, and that's how typically you make it shorter. Now within the service we have get next invoice number. So before that in the controller we had the get invoice number of getting max of invoice numbers +1. And then we violate that principle again. So if we do that inside of this service store new invoice as a method needs to be responsible only for storing new invoice. it doesn't need to know how to get the next invoice number. So for that, again, according to single responsibility principle, we have another method of getNextInvoiceNumber, which is responsible for getting invoice number. So we separate the responsibilities between the methods. So it's not only about which class is responsible for something, but also which method is responsible. You can do that in private method like this, or you can do it in the invoice here. So use the Eloquent functionality, because Eloquent may offer you this functionality. So you can assign invoice number directly in the creating part of boot model, boot method in Laravel model. So whichever class or whichever method you choose to move to, the main part here is to take away the responsibility from the class or the method that has too many responsibilities.